Hello class. This lecture is to get you ready to start the new genre. We're going to be beginning to read the epic and specifically our new work, which is the Odyssey. And that down there is Odysseus with Calypso, who you will meet not in today's reading, but eventually. The first thing I want you to understand is the difference between an epic and the drama that we have been studying with for the first part of this semester. So they do have some similarities, especially since the epic we'll be looking at also comes from ancient Greece, which is the same period that the drama we were looking at came from. But in most cases, epics are written in verse, so they are in poetry just like the drama that we just saw would have been written in verse. Now, more modern dramas usually aren't written in verse, but this tradition actually lasted in drama up through the time of Shakespeare, so it was a pretty durable tradition. So that's a similarity between epic and drama. And another similarity is that they generally center on a great man, at least for tragedies like the one we looked at. Epics are about heroes, great heroes, like the Odyssey is about Odysseus, the Iliad focuses on Achilles and Hector, and the Aeneid focuses on Aeneas. Even later epics do the same thing. You've got things like Beowulf and even Christian epics like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They all have a great hero with a mission at the center of it. And the drama had the same thing. It focused on the struggles of one great man. And epics include elements of both comedy and tragedy, because, as I said, they're focused on a great man, so they have that element of an important action, very serious action to it, and they often have elements of comedy because epics are usually trying to create something. And they can have lower elements to them, like we described ancient comedies would have. For instance, there's a section at the very end of the Odyssey where Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, gets into a fist fight with another beggar over a sausage. So, epic can have both the high and low elements of drama. However, there are some pretty significant differences. Of course, epics are far longer than plays. Now, like drama, they would have had an audience, usually, and they would have been heard. They would have been sung in their original form, at least these ancient epics. However, people probably would have listened to them in smaller chunks, which is probably why it's divided into books, the way we have it. But their length makes them more comprehensive. They can include more than a drama. When we talked about a play, we talked about its unities. It had to focus on just one person doing just one thing in just one day. Epics aren't like that. They travel all over the place. The Odyssey in particular goes over the entire Mediterranean Sea. It can span incredibly long amounts of time. The events in this story take place over the course of about 10 years. It can include a huge cast of characters. It includes things like lists, factual details, descriptions, historical events. It's just a lot bigger, more comprehensive package. And whereas a drama had to be focused on just one story, an epic includes many smaller stories, and in fact many of these would have been told as little, or would have been sung as little standalone songs, like, ooh, tell us the one about the Cyclops, that's a great one. Or there are even kind of mini stories, like when Telemachus meets Menelaus. Menelaus tells this great adventure story of what happened to him on his way home from Troy. So it has these little smaller sort of chunks inside of it. And because it can include so many different things, so many different people, so many different kinds of actions, the point of an epic is to shape a culture and the identity of a people. An epic sort of puts in literary form what gives a people its meaning, what they think of themselves, and how they build their society. And that's what makes epics so important. They're sort of these foundational stories for the peoples who create them. This is what's important to us. This is what makes a hero. This is what we value. These are the stories we think need to be told to understand ourselves and who we are, what it means to be Greeks in this particular case. So epics are always incredibly important to the culture that creates them. There's always a question of what are they trying to tell themselves? What are they trying to tell other people about who they are and what they value? So we're going to be paying attention to that as we read the Odyssey. Now, the origins of the Odysseys in particular are not certain, because they are much older than the plays of Aeschylus that we just finished reading. They were obviously written by Homer, who is somebody you've probably heard of, but honestly, besides his name, we know almost nothing about him. Now, all of the earliest stories about Homer mention the fact that he was blind, and that he was a singer, so he would have sung these songs to his audiences. And in the Odyssey, you will actually see a couple of different bards, singers of these songs, as you read, who are sort of variants on this figure of Homer himself. But other than that, we really don't know anything about him. People have guessed that, scholars have guessed that the Odyssey was composed in the late 8th or early 7th century BC, so 200 or 300 years before the time of Aeschylus and the dramas we looked at. And even then, at that particular time, that would have been 200 or 300 years after the time of the Trojan War. So it kind of, what Homer is talking about here would have been ancient history by the time that he was composing about it. Now, I've mentioned that these songs were sung. They were spoken, sung, and meant to be heard by people. This is a time in Greece, this late 8th, early 7th century BC, where they're just starting to rediscover how to write again. Greece had gone through kind of a Dark Ages sort of period where they had, in essence, forgotten how to write down their language. So it's just barely emerging. This poem would have been composed and performed entirely from memory. Now, that doesn't mean that Homer had this incredible memory, although doubtless he did, and he just memorized this thing word for word and repeated it every time. There are indications that Homer actually improvised, that in essence he followed the same pattern every time, but that he would kind of change elements as needed as he kind of sang his song. So, for instance, you'll notice these sort of repeated chunks. Like, for instance, when someone shows up at someone's house, the description of what happens: they pour water over his hands, they pull up a shining table, the housekeeper brings appetizers. All of these things, they sound sort of similar. And that's because Homer would use these repeated elements and sort of fit them into the story as he was going along. It also explains some of the variations in setting and time, in that Homer was almost certainly one of many bards, singers who were telling this story. And they would listen to each other, and they would kind of pick up things that they liked, dropped things that they didn't like, and so on, which meant that the geography is not terribly stable. Like, nobody could possibly map out any sort of actual description of the journey Odysseus really takes. If you try and do it, it's just impossible. People have attempted, but no two maps really look the same, because it just doesn't make enough sense. The timing is sometimes off. Like, there are sometimes they have only bronze weapons, other times they have iron weapons, which is something like that came substantially later. So those kind of anachronisms are in there because of the oral origins of the Odyssey. It's not a consistent whole piece of invention like you'd see in a novel where the whole thing's coming from one person's brain and it's meant to be a consistent story. The Odyssey is a work of art, and Homer clearly did produce a work of genius in assembling it together, but it doesn't work the way a novel works, and if you expect it to work like that, you're going to be disappointed. So that's kind of what's behind how the Odyssey was created as an epic. Now I just want to look at another example of an ancient Greek epic that you're probably familiar with, namely the Iliad. The Iliad was also composed by Homer. It's the only other work we have by him, almost certainly before he composed the Odyssey. It's sort of like a prequel, but not exactly. It obviously is about the Trojan War. And there are some really interesting differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad is a poem of war. It's about how men fight. And in the Odyssey, although it is clearly, people clearly do fight in it, and it ends in a great big bloody battle scene, it's ultimately a story about peace. How do you rebuild a society after it's been torn apart by a war? The Iliad is about the conflicts that make people die for their honor. The Odyssey is about what happens when you go home. What happens when these heroes who've been scarred in battle need to return to their wives and their children and the people they left behind. And obviously, because it's a story about war, the Iliad's kind of main preoccupation, or one of its main preoccupations, is how to die with honor, what it means to die with honor, and whether it's worth it. The Odyssey is about how to live. All of its main characters, except, of course, the suitors, end up alive. They have to figure out how to come back from a war and how to live in society, how to continue building up the community that they left behind them at home. And finally, the Iliad is almost exclusively a male world. Like, there are a few women in it occasionally, like they fight over women, and Helen makes a brief appearance to say self-deprecating things. Andromache makes a brief and touching appearance, but it's basically a guy's story. Women don't do anything major for the action of the plot, and it's just all about men and their fighting. In the Odyssey, on the other hand, women are incredibly important from the very beginning of it. It's got incredibly strong female characters who drive the plot as much as the men do, if not more so. So the Odyssey is a story about men and women together and their relationships with each other. The dangers of those, and believe me, there are plenty of dangerous women in the Odyssey, and the beauty that can have. The Odyssey is, the only ancient Greek epic that has a beautiful vision of a marriage and what a good marriage looks like. So it's, again, about this sort of foundation of this society, the marriage, the family. How do you put it back together, and how do you create a society that can survive in peace? And those are the differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I know some of you are reading it now for one of your classes, or may have read it in the past. So I just wanted to point out those differences to kind of help you understand how the Odyssey is different. Now let's take a quick look at the opening lines of the Odyssey. Now the opening lines of any epic are always particularly important because they're usually a sort of a very brief little capsule of the entire story. The ancient Greeks didn't believe in spoilers, so they're absolutely willing to give away exactly what's going to happen at the end. So let's take a look. It says, "Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy." Now this "sing to me" opening is what's called an invocation to the muse, and that was a traditional element of epics. They always began this way, and this is the muse of poetic inspiration, right? They were going to sing, they were going to create something, and so they needed the inspiration of the muse of this particular god, and there was a specific muse of epic who would watch over their song. Now, note here that we begin to get a description of Odysseus as a man of twists and turns. It's the first and one of the core sort of characteristics of Odysseus. He's a man of twists and turns. He's tricky. He's crafty. He's hard to understand. And since we were just talking about the Iliad, this is completely opposite of any of the men in the Iliad, who were pretty straightforward and easy to understand. They weren't out to trick anybody. Odysseus, on the other hand, is crafty. And the next few lines tell us a little bit more about him and his goals. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. So what more do we see of him here? One, he's curious. He's an explorer. He wants to see and learn. He doesn't just want to get home, although clearly he does want that very badly. He wants to know about the things he passes, and his desire for knowledge is again one of Odysseus's core traits. But he's also one who suffers, and he has to just endure. But at the same time, and this is sort of a contradictory characteristic, he is not just one who suffers, one who something happens to. He's also a fighter. He fights to save his life and bring his comrades home. But it goes on. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. So it's describing, in essence, the failure of his mission to bring his comrades home because of their own recklessness. It blames them right from the beginning. It's all their own fault because they ate the cattle of the sun god, and he wiped from sight the day of their return. This notion of the day of their return, the homecoming, the final homecoming of the warriors after the war, was incredibly important to the Greeks. They called it the nostos. And they even had this whole category of songs and stories called nostoi, which is the story of the hero's homecoming. And the Odyssey is obviously one of these, and it contains many sort of mini nostoi within it. We hear the homecoming story of Nestor, of Menelaus, and of course of Agamemnon, who the play we just read is in essence his nostoi. It's his homecoming story. His obviously ends much worse than Odysseus is done. But in some ways they face similar dangers, and we'll talk about that in class next week. So pay attention to Odysseus' relationship to his own homecoming and what he has to do to keep it in mind as you read. Finally, launch out on his story muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. And this is, again, the traditional ending to this invocation to the muse, to this beginning of an epic poem. They begin in medias res. That means right in the middle of things. And this will tell, and at this point, the bard, the poet, asks the muse, hey, start here. And this one is unusual in that it says, start wherever you want. And that is exactly what the muse does, as we'll see here. So instead of beginning at the beginning and going on till you come to the end, epics usually start in medias res. In the middle of things, the action has already gotten going, and you're kind of dropped right into the middle of it. And that's what happens here. The Odyssey actually begins kind of at year 19 3/4 of Odysseus' 20-year absence. He's almost home, actually, at the point that the book starts. The book actually starts by focusing on Telemachus, and who goes on a trip to look for his father. And that's what's described in books 1 to 4. Kind of meanwhile, that's around the same time that Odysseus finally escapes from the 7 years, approximately, he's been stuck on an island with Calypso, and that's described in books 5 to 8. So this all happens right before he actually comes back in year 20. But then what's unusual about this is that book 9 jumps all the way back to year 10. And Odysseus tells the story of how he got there, everything that happened from the end of the Trojan War through to his escape from Calypso. And 3 of those years are in books 9 to 12. And that's probably what you think of when you think of the Odyssey. Those are the stories you heard when you were younger. That has the Cyclops in it. That has Scylla and Charybdis. That has the Sirens. That has Circe. That has the trip to the underworld. All of the exciting things that you think of when you think of the Odyssey are in those 4 books right there. And actually, he spends 7 years doing nothing at all but sitting on an island and kind of crying about it with Calypso, who won't let him go. So the bulk of his 10-year journey home is actually spent kind of sitting around, not having adventures. But after he describes those adventures in books 9 to 12, the rest of the epic describes how Odysseus and also Telemachus return home and kill all the suitors and sort of set things to right back in Ithaca. So actually, since the Odyssey has 24 books, more than half of it, or about half of it, is spent after he gets back home to Ithaca, which means that the focus is not just, hey, look at this crazy trip Odysseus took. The crazy trip Odysseus took is only half the book. The other half is sort of setting to rights what's gone wrong in Ithaca. And that's one of the questions I want you to think about for our discussion next week. What is so bad in Ithaca? Why is this problem so bad? Why does Telemachus need to go on a journey so he can come back and sort of join up with his dad for this mission of killing the suitors? What makes the suitors so dangerous? I want you to think about that. We'll talk about that next week, and I'll see you then.